So Mary, a lot of your comics seem to be, at least the ones I saw, were autobiographical or seem to be based on true stories, as opposed, I guess, to your written stuff. What was your approach with doing autobiographical or biographical work? Do you think that that's a particularly important thing to do in queer comics, or?
He's intimating that having adventures and fucks a lot isn't your autobiographical.
No, you haven't seen my comics, have you?
I might take your social life for a week and what happened. What was the question again?
A queer voice in autobiography and biography.
Oh yeah, I think that's really standard in underground comics. That was one of the first things that you were saying in the last panel, Trina, that you saw. And you were in the East Village in the 60s. And I remember, what was the Justin Hall one about the Virgin Mary?
Oh, Justin Brown.
Justin Brown, right.
Brown and the Virgin Mary.
That was it.
Justin
Sorry. There's a lot of Justins in the room. Anyway, so I think that there were a lot of things like that, and that one was very impressive. I enjoyed that tremendously. I remember.
Dinky Brown and the Holy Virgin Mary was a story by Justin Green, which was probably the first, a groundbreaking cartoon, and that was the first story I ever saw where a cartoonist did something about their inner life, their real angst, instead of it being escapist literature. And it influenced a lot of us. Harvey Picard gets too much credit for doing autobiographical cartooning. I always give credit to Justin Green for that.
Vaughn, your work has in Gay Comics has a feeling of both a kind of documenting queer history and culture, but is also kind of surreal. So it seems very surreal. So it has this. I feel like there is this kind of autobio and very kind of realistic elements to it, but then it kind of veers off in these surreal tangents and elements. Do you think of yourself as documenting queer life in San Francisco during this time, or do you think of yourself as more of a fantastical storyteller?
Very much so. I was documenting a time. I mean, there again, I was working for newspapers, and I was fortunate that became the whole pages to cartooning. Yeah. I mean, that was a real draw for me, literally, because most cartoon strips are just these small little 4 panels. I had a whole page to just take a theme of the day and really run with it. That's what a lot of my published work in Gay Comics was, and then in Watch Out Comics, was just collections of my newspaper comic strips. Yeah. And my work did start out far more cartoony in the beginning, and now the work I'm doing is far more serious looking, far more realistic.
This is Stan Stone. Was it your character Stan Stone or Stan Stone?
Stan Stone was the character I was known the most for. It began with correspondences I was doing with a friend in Seattle when I moved to San Francisco. He'd write me, say about getting his apartment sprayed for cockroaches. So I'd do little drawings and send back to him. And then he came down to San Francisco to visit me. And I drew a comic strip about him, and that became one of my most popular characters. I was on the verge of reviving him a few years ago, but then he passed suddenly, and I still would like to do more with the character at some point.
Burton, your comics also, I feel like there's a documentary, almost realistic senses to them, and these kind of fantastical elements that get thrown in. And you have the kind of the devil character that shows up in one of the stories, and but then also some autobiographical things like the last piece in number 25.
Well, the very first story that I did was called Cyrus and the SQ syndrome. SQ standing for Snow Queen, and this was like in the early 80s, and it was an issue since Howard, wanted us to deal with things that were more personal and honest. It was about black guys who were at the time into Caucasians, and that was sort of because there were so few ethnic images in the gay press or in even the gay life. I mean, black people or minorities or Asians, you just didn't see them. They weren't in magazines or they weren't in comics. And I just felt that this is an issue that we've talked about with friends of mine, but that I had never seen in a comic. So I figured, this is a story that I could probably tell, and that would probably touch a few nerves. I didn't know how it would be received, but I decided to put it out there anyway. And Howard was actually very instrumental, because like I said, I'm not the best writer, but Howard was very helpful in helping me structure my script so that it tightened it up and made it a much more interesting story.
Did Howard or, I mean, you, Robert, did you, how hands-on were you guys as editors during the run of I mean, did you feel like you had to, I mean, that you would come in and give story advice and narrative advice?
I like to let people do what they wanted. The whole point of Gay Comics was to give individual stories about individual lives. Occasionally, I would come up with an idea that I would ask somebody else to do. One of my favorite pieces by Vaughn, we did a superhero parody issue, and I came up with the idea for a comic called Leather Thing. I said, and I gave the title to Vaughn, and he came up with something that was so much funnier than I could imagine, about a leather queen in an attitude bar, and then when you look underneath, he's covered head to toe in leather, and finally into the story, you look inside, there's nothing there. I thought I'd never have thought of that. Some of the covers I thought of ideas, and I'd be too overextended or worn out. I didn't want to hog the comic book, so I asked other people to illustrate ideas that I came up with for covers. We did a Keen cover, a sad-eyed Keen cover. And there was an art director at the Bay Area Reporter, a friend of mine named Peter Keen, who was not a cartoonist, not even an illustrator. And I got him to do the cover, and it's actually my favorite cover in the whole series. And I'll put it on the screen if I can figure out how. How do you work this crazy thing?
So while you're doing that, one thing I wanted to kind of jump on what Burton was talking about was this idea that I feel a lot of gay media and gay comics will either be kind of non-confrontational to be read by oftentimes by straight people, or to feel kind of a feel-good thing within the community, or they're very sexual. And gay comics is plays with both of that stuff, but really there's a lot of kind of airing the dirty laundry of the gay community. And was that something that you guys were excited about doing, like kind of being able to do critiques within the within gay culture?
I think to some extent, yes. It operated more about what actually just occurred to us. Sometimes I'd be talking with Howard on the phone, and we'd be talking about what's going on in our lives lately, and something that would be said would key off an idea to develop a story.
Mm-hmm.
So that
I've got to say, I'm pretty sure this is true of Howard as well as myself, that at the time we were doing gay comics, especially the gay male culture was so swamped with erotica. It was either showbiz or erotica, or politics, but not much else. And we were proud of the fact that Gay Comics was, and probably still is, the only humor magazine for gay people. But humor involves satire as well, and I remember when I was the editor sending out a letter saying two things. One, let's not be afraid to satirize our own community because we're overripe for it. And the other one being, in terms of political arguments, you can win an argument better by making somebody laugh than you can by arguing with them about it. So let's go for humor.